Another week, another nor'easter. Welcome back to the Surfline Live Forecaster discussion. This is Surfline Director of Forecasting, Mark Willis. I've got lead forecaster Korte with me, and we're here out of our office on the Outer Banks, and we're analyzing Winter Storm Skylar. We've got just another fairly big storm. We've got seas. All the buoys off the East Coast are pretty much 10 to 20 feet right now at 11 to 13 seconds. Closer to the core of the storm, the seas are a little bit bigger, and we're taking a live look at conditions throughout the northeastern United States and parts of the mid-Atlantic coastline, and we're looking at Rockaway Beach in Long Island, New York. How's it look there to you, Kurt?
Looks really good. It's definitely improved some from what we saw early this morning. Saw a little bit of snow there early in the day, but some really good lefts coming off the groin and favorable conditions.
We've changed over. It looks like, gosh, this is where we're at now.
This is Long Beach Island.
Long Beach Island. Jersey, also another place that's gotten better through the day. One thing that we're looking out for in Long Island compared to New Jersey is the winds have shifted from north to northwest and even a little west-northwest. So that's starting to put a little sideshore texture in Long Island, but that's a good thing for New Jersey.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about what the storm's actually doing and how that's impacting our local winds and conditions. But basically, the storm's starting to gain a little more latitude, and as that occurs, our winds are trending from north, which this morning in Long Island's all good conditions, to northwest, and even eventually west-northwest here. So as that turns on spots in New Jersey, some of the spots in Long Island are going to see a little more sideshore texture, especially western Long Island.
And when you compare some of the buoy observations to this storm to Winter Storm Riley that was last week and the weekend before last, there's some similarities, but some differences, especially with period. Like, for example, the 44017 buoy south of Montauk, currently around 15 feet at 11 seconds, which is respectable. Riley actually peaked at 15 at 12 seconds, so pretty close there from a swell height perspective. The period was a little bit longer with Riley, and that's kind of what we're seeing up and down the mid-Atlantic states. The other big difference with this is first of all, it's going to move much quicker, which is going to limit its potential to produce a prolonged swell event. But we're also looking at a less substantial event further south into Florida and the Caribbean too.
Yes, and that lends itself partially because of the fact this storm is moving pretty quickly away, whereas Riley hung around for several days. And if we could go back and look at some of the buoy observations from that, you could see kind of a pretty quick increase in swell, but that swell was really slow to fade. Spots along Long Island saw days of pumping surf. And in contrast to that, this storm's going to be kind of that quick one and done thing that we see sometimes. And as you mentioned, one of the things that we saw with Riley was that really big fetch that was directed towards the south, down towards spots like down in Florida, and then also the Caribbean. And while we do see some winds that are directed in that direction, we don't think it's going to be a significant swell event for those spots.
And we've said Riley a few times. We've said Skylar with this storm, and we had Quinn late last week. And it's funny that we're just kind of gravitating towards these names of these storms, which is something that's at least a little bit controversial still in our field. But the fact of the matter is, it can be an easy way to remember these things and to make them noticeable for people listening in too.
That's a great point. You look back at the last 2 weeks, we've had 3 strong nor'easters, and without those names, you're like, oh, well, that one that was, last week, and then the one that was like 2 weeks ago, and you can kind of get them confused. So having the names makes it a little easier on us, and I think the communication also improves, which is important.
And we're looking at, I believe, Rockaway 90th right now. We just saw a set that was definitely overhead. If I was doing the reports, I would at least go 5 to 7. It looks like there are probably some sets that are well overhead. The conditions are kind of teetering back and forth between offshore and side offshore. Looks like the northwest winds trending west-northwest are making at least a few of these sets a little bit challenging.
Definitely. We've seen a change in conditions even from when we did our afternoon surf reports a few hours ago when the winds were still north or north-northwest. Since then, you can definitely see some of that up the face chop and chatter going up there, which can make it pretty challenging, especially, when you figure the water temperature is right around 40 degrees, air temperatures, it obviously snowed earlier today, so it's cold. And then you add in the fact that, you have had high overhead waves and maybe a 15 mile an hour plus wind coming up the face. Some of those lefts are definitely going to be pretty challenging.
but still definitely some good waves in the mix as well. I think the buoys are, around the New York Harbor entrance buoy is around 10 feet at 11 seconds from an east-southeast direction. And as you can see, that's producing several good looking lefts on our Rockaway cam. And we're taking a live look at some of the satellite imagery from the GO 16 satellite right now. And if you turn the clock back about a week, you'd see something very similar to this, but there are some subtle differences in here, Kurt. For example, a lot of those little popcorn shaped clouds off the mid-Atlantic and Carolinas, a lot of that stuff is heading west to east, which is a sign that the winds are aimed west to east and pushing a lot of swell to Europe. But to the north of the system and just to the east of the center, there is a lot of wind still aimed at the East Coast, especially New England, and a pretty impressive storm overall. We were looking at some satellite drive winds earlier. This morning in the past, there was a swath of 30 to 45 knot winds that was pretty impressive.
It definitely was. And one of the things that you could really note here on the satellite imagery and then looking at our Lola Wayfight animation is the storm is moving rather quickly, as we mentioned earlier, and that's going to limit the duration of the swell. And because of the orientation of those winds, especially on the backside of it, as you said, more of a west to easterly wind, most of that swell is going to head out towards the central Atlantic, eventually over towards the eastern half of the Atlantic basin rather than down towards the Caribbean. That being said, a lot of times we do see a small little fetch take shape off the mid-Atlantic in New England, which can send a longer period pulse of north-northwest swell down to spots like Puerto Rico. And a lot of times that'll blend in with some of the winds off of the southeastern coastline, which sets up like a northwest swell. So it's kind of a challenging situation, especially when you have a storm that's moving away from your area. It's an intense storm, but those intense winds are over a relatively small area of ocean. And then you also have it propagating through an area of winds that are somewhat opposed to the way the swell is actually going. So kind of a bunch of different variables, whereas, the swell from Winter Storm Riley was pretty much a slam dunk. It was more of a how big is it going to be and how long is it going to be that big? This is more of a what's the timing of this swell pulse? Is it going to hit overnight? And then, what are the conditions going to be like down there in the Caribbean?
And it turns out those winds on the northwest and north side of the storm, the ones that we're most interested in on the East Coast, because they're aimed at the East Coast, are often underestimated by the models, especially if it's north of an occluded front sometimes where you can get some really strong winds. And so that's something that we're going to be analyzing and looking at the models compared to the real-time conditions. And be sure to check out the premium analysis section of our forecast to see if we think Lola and some of the other wave models out there are a little bit low, which is often the case with these storms.
Yeah, so one of the things I was doing today as the storm was intensifying was looking at the buoys that are up there in the Northwest Atlantic. And one of the ones that really I love checking out during storms like this is the Georges Bank buoy. Unfortunately, that buoy is adrift, so it's not in that normal location, which is basically pretty much east-southeast of Cape Cod. And that's really in the honey hole right there where you can get a good indication of how much swell is heading towards New England, and then also how much of it is heading back towards other parts of the East Coast. It can give you a really good heads up on whether the storm is handled well by the models and whether it's exceeding expectations and producing larger wave heights or even longer periods well.
And we're back on the Rockaway 90th cam. We've got this and the 77th Street cam on Surfline, and quite a day for the Rockaways. The surf is generally in the 5 to 7 foot range on the face with some sets in the well overhead range. Winds are out of the northwest at a good 20 to 25 knots, which is making conditions challenging at times. Still lots of guys out though, and plenty of waves to be had, mostly lefts coming off the jetties though.
Yes, and you can see we had a pretty good size set that came through a few minutes ago, and that water is trying to get its way out here. We have an incoming tide. We had low tide around 11:45 a.m., and that's pushing up towards a high tide at 5:51 p.m. So a lot of water moving through there, and a lot of times, after you get some of those bigger sets, it can get kind of ripped out and weird for a few minutes as some of that water tries to get back out.
And if you're just joining us now, this is Surfline Director of Forecasting, Mark Willis, and I've got lead forecaster Korte with me, and we're taking a live look at conditions associated with this swell from winter storm or nor'easter Skylar that is pushing off the northeast coast right now. We've got widespread winter weather up and down the New England coastline, lots of power outages and a lot of swell in the water too. Thanks for joining us. And if you have any comments or questions that you would like Kurt and or myself to address, feel free to bring those up in the comment section and we'll try to get to those as quickly as we can. We're looking at 4 cams throughout the Northeast United States coastline right now. lots of fun waves between New Jersey and Rhode Island right now.
Yeah, so the cam up there in the top left corner, or was up there in the top left corner, is our Matunic cam from Rhode Island. And I was actually talking to Dennis Murphy, one of our cam operations team members, and he was working with the local ISP there. The cam went down due to some internet issues, but we got it back up here. But obviously, there's blizzard warnings from parts of coastal Massachusetts up through New Hampshire and Maine. A lot of snow happening there. I saw some predictions of up to around 2 feet or so. But further to the south, that's where we're seeing the improving conditions as the low starts to pass each respective region. We've seen pumping surf through much of the day in Long Island. Now that the winds are gaining a more westerly component, we're starting to see some really good surf for select spots in New Jersey. And for us down here in the Outer Banks, I can't help but feel a little jealous. I feel like Jersey and Long Island have been scoring with these last couple swells, and we've kind of been getting the skunk.
We have. It looks like we could get a little window late today into tomorrow, but nothing like our friends to our north are going to see. And of course, the big difference with this storm compared to Winter Storm Riley is that this one's going to be moving out to sea quicker. It's not going to sit there and spin like Riley did and produce days of dare I say, near historic swell for the East Coast. So you're going to have to get this event pretty quickly.
Yes, and it's interesting to note also that this storm was analyzed most recently at 971 millibars, whereas Riley bottomed out at 973 millibars. So actually, the storm is slightly stronger than Riley. But again, all those other variables that we're looking at as far as speed, how long it's going to be over the ocean, we definitely are not expecting the historic run from this one like we did from Riley.
That's right. We got a couple of questions. People want to know where we're looking at. We've got Matunic, Rhode Island in the upper left, and now we've zoomed in on Rockaway. We're back to the 4-screen view now. These are cams throughout Long Island, New York, and Rhode Island, and I believe the bottom right is from New Jersey, near Long Beach Island. Did I get those correct, Kurt?
Yes. So clockwise from the top left, your Matunic. Oh, we're going to switch over to the Rockaway 77th cam there for a second. We saw some really good waves coming off of that jetty there. I think right before we got started with the Facebook Live, we saw a guy get a pretty good barrel right after 3 p.m. So for those of you that like checking out cam rewinds, there's a pretty good one right around 3:05 or so on that Rockaway 77th cam. As we look at the 4-screen here, top left, again, Rhode Island, as we switch over clockwise to the right, that's Rockaway 90th. Down, that's Long Beach Island, which saw some really good surf for several days during Riley, and obviously there's some pretty good lefts there right now. And then the bottom left is Rockaway 77th. So plenty of waves up there, but again, most spots in the head high, a little bit over head range, and seeing some pretty good surf.
And I just got a question about, is this swell coming to Florida? And the answer is yes, but not nearly as substantial as what we saw with Winter Storm Riley. I think the question I got specifically was really to South Florida. And when we look at these kind of storms for South Florida, you really want to look on the west and northwest side of the center of circulation to see how much north winds are aimed at you, especially if they're out of the shadow of Cape Hatteras, where we are pretty close to here on the Outer Banks. But this storm's just moving too quick to produce a substantial swell for Florida, but there will be a little swell trickling down there. Mike Watson is our meteorologist that is issuing our Florida forecast this week, and he has just updated that forecast. So be sure to check out. We do 4 forecasts for the Atlantic side of Florida, North Florida, Central Florida, the Treasure Coast and Palm Beach, and then Dade and Broward counties. So be sure to check those out, how this swell is going to react down there. But we can tell you here live that it's not going to be nearly as substantial as Winter Storm Riley because of the things that we've already talked about, primarily the storm moving so quickly out to sea.
I know some spots in South Florida did see a little bit of a northwest wind swell event earlier today, courtesy of some of the winds that I mentioned earlier, the northwest winds that occurred off the southeast and Florida coastline. There was a quick shot of that for select spots. Wow, that's a really good left coming through. Here comes somebody, drop it in. I'm going to do my Joe Turpel. He's off the bottom. He's off the top. He's hooking it in. Caught up on the top of the lip there for a second. He's going to ride that one out. He's going to try to look for the reform on the inside.
And you can see some of the west-northwest, the northwest wind starting to put some chatter up the face now, can't you, Kurt?
Definitely. You can see him getting hung up a little bit on that. And I think that will continue over the rest of the afternoon. I think the winds are going to continue to trend more westerly, which is going to put a little more of that side shore chop up the face for spots along western Long Island. Definitely seen some solid surf here on the Rockaway 77th cam. Not as many people out there, but we've seen some really good laughs rifling through between the groins there. And yeah, you're Goofy Foot. I know you'd like to be up there catching a couple of those waves.
I would. I was a little distracted because I got a comment from Jonathan Hackett saying that Willis surfs in a Speedo. So that's, always interesting. But back to the main event here. Yeah,
not in Long Island, you wouldn't.
Yeah, we definitely wouldn't want to be wearing that in Long Island. I think you at least need a hooded 5.4 and at least 5mm boots and some pretty thick gloves too.
Yes, I saw our water temps were hovering right around 40 degrees, and we update the water temps all along the East Coast every single day, and the latest readings are in the low 40s there. So pretty challenging conditions, and it's been pretty cold actually recently, and looks like that trend's going to continue as another solid set comes through on our Rockaway 90th cam. You can see some pretty good surf coming through, a little crowd out there, and yeah, some fun waves. That actually is one of the bigger waves I've seen so far coming through on our Rockaway cam. Back to that earlier question for Florida. One of the things that we look for, as you mentioned, the storm moving away is a negative. The strength of the storm is actually what we would look for. But South Florida is just a beast when it comes to forecasting, not only because you have the Bahamas there, but if you get down into spots, south of Palm Beach, your swell window is really narrow to get swell down in there. So the storm kind of needs to set up in a favorable location for that swell to make it all the way down into spots like South Beach. And as Mark mentioned, and I think Mike talks about in his forecast, we're not thinking that it's going to make it all the way down there. I would expect a little pulse of swell, however, but it's not going to be anything like Riley. Heck, you can probably wait another couple of years and it won't be anything like Riley again. So definitely some fun waves coming through here. As the storm moves out over the next 12 to 24 hours, we're going to see dropping wave heights. But some spots should see a window of a fun surf again tomorrow. Eyeing those breaks definitely up into New England, northern New England, New Hampshire, and Maine. Obviously, it's going to be an issue getting even to the beach because some of the spots are projected to have over a foot or a foot and a half of snowfall. But they're definitely can handle it a little bit better than we can down here in the South. I know our schools have been out for something like 8 days on the Outer Banks so far this year due to inclement weather, including some of our snowstorms. And they have a very hard time getting that snow off the road.
That's right. And they had an early dismissal yesterday because of the wind and also some coastal flooding. I believe Cape Hatteras schools were still out today. So yeah, it's been an interesting winter to say the least. And I just brought up some buoy observations that we can go over real quick, Kurt. So the Nantucket buoy 44008 checking in at 24.6 feet at 10 seconds. Montauk Point 44017 just under 10 feet at 10 seconds. And the Texas Tower buoy 44066 around 15 feet at 12 seconds. So these numbers aren't quite as substantial as Riley, especially from a wave period perspective, but it has been producing some fairly impressive numbers. And this March is off to one of the better starts to any March I can ever remember. And it happens to be on the heels of a February that was above normal pretty much everywhere on the entire East Coast.
Yes, we've definitely seen a really interesting winter. We had a really cold period basically from the middle part of December through January. And then it got warm and we had some waves, and now it's cold again. And we've seen some really solid surf. So it'll be interesting as we go back and tally up, the average wave heights for various locations along the East Coast and really see how the past couple of months have shaken out. But, it's pretty impressive that we've seen so much surf, really. And that's on the heels of really an incredibly active tropical season. So, over the past 6 to 8 months, it's been a really consistent, good run of waves for many locations along the East Coast.
Which is pretty much the opposite of what our friends and colleagues in Southern California have seen, which has been a pretty slow, especially February and beginning of March. So we will take it, and we'll take a little jab at our friends on the West Coast because it's been better on the East Coast. We got a question from a Brian Waters. What is the water temp in New York? And we just updated our water temps on all of our cam and report pages. Looks like it's in the low 40s, 40 to 43 is what we put in this morning. So if you guys are wondering how we accumulate water temps, the ones that we put on our camera report pages, we actually, I think Kurt was alluding to it earlier, but we go through all the observations in a given area, whether that be from satellite, from buoys, sometimes lifeguards, sometimes other sources, and we accumulate all that data and we put it on all of our cam pages once a day. So right now in Long Island, New York, in the low 40s, so still pretty cold.
And we actually have some spotters that go out and do the old method of throwing a line out and measuring the temperature. I know our dedicated reporter down in Buxton, Keith Andre, sends in water temperatures every morning. And that's one of the most dynamic areas for water temperatures you'll see anywhere along the East Coast. It can jump up and down several degrees depending on the wind and the weather and stuff. It's definitely a crazy environment down there in Buxton. But looking at our Lido Beach Cam, some pretty good surf coming through there. It's an interesting spot. I love watching this cam as you have a nice view. Looking down at the surf a little bit, you can really see it coming in and bending and kind of producing these A-frames that just look incredible. I love watching this cam.
Yeah, the shape there is great. Something that we struggle with sometimes on the Outer Banks. Looks like they've got some good sand. And looking at the New York Harbor buoy, which is just offshore of this location, looks like it's around 9 feet at 12 seconds from the east-southeast. That's combined wave heights. Let me see if I can get a better reading on the actual swell numbers. Yeah, so like 7 or 8 feet at 12 seconds from the east-southeast. Pretty good swell for Western Long Island because it bends in and it produces these great lefts. And when you accompany that with northwest winds, you usually have pretty good surf.
Yes, and if you're around that area, you're definitely going to want to try to get in the water soon because I think the winds are going to trend even more side shore for Western Long Island. That's not a good thing for there, but that is a good thing for spots in northern New Jersey as we expect improving conditions here. One thing you got to worry about is we do have a higher tide coming up around 5:50. But there should be plenty of fun surf up into parts of New Jersey. One new feature on Surfline that I really like is our last light that's there. And again, with the time change, we have a sunset right around 7 p.m., but we have last light lasting until around 7:25. So definitely going to be a nice window after work in New Jersey. If you're able to get out there and get a few, it looks like a good time to do it because definitely smaller surf in the wake of this system.
And the other great thing about the new feature on new.surfline.com is our human forecast, the regional forecast that we do have AM and PM forecasts instead of just AM. So we can tell our users when there's going to be a change through the day. And there was definitely a change in New Jersey today for the better. Although, like you said, you got to watch out for that high tide just before dark.
Yes, that was. I know all the forecasters were very excited when that was a feature that we were adding, and I know our users are the same. This is a great scenario when that is, a great thing to have. Basically, this morning there were some tide issues. The wind was a little funky for New Jersey, so in the past when we were focusing on the 7 to 9 a.m. time frame, you really couldn't give it that great conditions because during that time it really wasn't going to be. So you had to communicate it, either during the discussion or within the forecast boxes that there are going to be changes. Now it's easy, it's visual. You can just see like, okay, in the morning it's going to be blue and in the afternoon it's going to be gold, and you know exactly when you should target.
And Kurt, we just got another question from a Jonathan Torrey. Any chance this swell will bless the Caribbean? And we've already talked extensively during this live forecast discussion that this storm is moving away quicker. It's got a lot of fetch from west to east, but there is a little area just to the west, northwest of the center that is going to have some winds and already does have some winds aimed at the Caribbean. But I was looking at things a little bit before we went online and went live. Looks like more like a 6-foot swell at 13 seconds compared to a 16-foot at 16 second swell that we got from Riley. What are some of the things that you're looking at and will continue to look at as it relates to the Caribbean forecast?
Yes, I've been on the Caribbean forecast this week, and definitely not going to see swell like what we saw from Riley, but we rarely do. So this actually looks like a really good pattern we're in to send fun size surf, northwest swell down to parts like Puerto Rico. And again, be more in that fun range, whereas that last swell was maxed out at many locations and you had people towing in at trace. This is going to be more the fun thing where it makes rideable fun surf for many locations along the northwestern side of the island. Trade winds don't look that strong, so you're going to see a few options even in the morning along the north coast. But again, looking at more of that head high overhead sets kind of range as the swell fills in. And it does look like we'll see elevated northwest winds continue over the northwest Atlantic over the next several days. So that's going to keep some reinforcing pulses of swell in the water later in the week and even into the weekend. And there's actually some stuff on the radar for next week that looks pretty interesting for the Central Caribbean as well. One more thing about the Caribbean, Barbados was a standout during the Riley swell. But this storm is actually borderline where you want one for a decent swell for the west coast of Barbados because you have some blockage by the Windward Islands there from certain swell directions. So not a great swell for Barbados, but definitely some fun waves for central and parts of the Eastern Caribbean.
So back to what we're looking at on the screen here. Thanks for that update on the Caribbean, Kurt. We're looking at live Surfline cams throughout New England through New Jersey. We've got surf generally anywhere between chest to a couple, even a few feet overhead in the case of Western Long Island and New Jersey, a little bit small in Rhode Island, but conditions are good there. And this is all associated with Winter Storm Skylar that is dropping tons of snow, has produced widespread power outages, and obviously lots of surf throughout the Northeast United States coastline. The big difference with this storm compared to Winter Storm Riley is it's going to be moving out to sea much quicker. So this swell is going to drop quicker than what we saw with Riley. But there will be a couple of other locations up and down the coast outside of just the Northeast states that get good over the next 48 hours, but just nothing like what we saw with Riley at all.
No, that's right. And I was looking at some of the observations. We've already seen some wind gust up to around 70 miles an hour. I know Jeanette's Pier here on the Outer Banks registered 69 miles an hour last night. But again, the main story as far as the swell is concerned is the short duration of the peak of the swell. And that's because of the quick movement of the low, the fact it's going to move over the Canadian Maritimes. As we see a pretty solid set approaching here on the Rockaway 90th cam, you can definitely see, even since we've started this live, there's been a little more texture coming up the face there. But wow, that's a pretty solid set in the overhead range. One of the bigger ones we've seen, and not many takers on this one.
Now, I don't think I would call that quite double overhead, but it's getting kind of close. I would definitely say that's an 8-foot face.
I would say so.
So yeah, surf in Western Long Island is currently in the 5 to 8 foot range, maybe a little bit bigger on some of these bigger sets. But as we've mentioned several times today, the winds are starting to become a factor for Long Island. For New Jersey, it is starting to clean up. So be sure to think about surfing there if you're in the Garden State for the rest of the day. It's definitely worth a check. And there should be some leftovers tomorrow, but it's going to be fading quick.
That is correct. We're taking a look at our Manasquan cam now, and I'll tell you what, this is one of the most crowded spots when it's working. And it's amazing to me that there's not really anybody out there right now, because I have seen probably 100 people on this cam during similar swell events as this. So you would think that the crew's probably doing some searching around now that conditions are cleaning up, but you can see some pretty solid surf, maybe some closeouts here on our actual cam. So maybe that's one of the reasons that nobody's out there. But, again, over the next couple hours, we have pretty much 3.5 hours or so left of daylight, and after work, after school, looking like a good time to get in the water for Jersey.
And that forecaster speaking was Korte. I'm Mark Willis. We are here live from our Outer Banks, North Carolina office, taking a live look into conditions up and down the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states from Winter Storm Skylar. And we've got surf anywhere between chest to a few feet overhead, depending on your exposure to the swell. A lot of east in the direction for most of the locations, which makes it challenging for places like Rhode Island, but it is getting into some of our more exposed breaks in Rhode Island. And when we were live last week, Rob Mitzteifer and myself were talking about how challenging of a forecast it is for Rhode Island in these situations, just because you've got a lot of shadowing to deal with and just different exposure throughout that complex coastline. But they are getting some fun waves from Skylar as well.
Yes, and definitely in a dynamic situation like this, where you have a strengthening low that's moving relatively quickly, you have these separate fetches that set up, and it makes it really difficult to decide exactly how much of that's going to get into a some shadowed spot, like some of the breaks in Rhode Island. Definitely an easier call for breaks like Long Island that have a little bit better easterly exposure. And obviously Jersey was pretty much a slam dunk. It was just a matter of whether the winds were going to improve enough during the second half of the day. Looking at our Matunic cam, it's snowing. It looks like there's a couple people out there, but it's kind of hard to see through that snow. Gosh, it's making me chilly just looking at it.
It is. And we got one more question from Shane Jost. Is Central Florida going to get any swell from this storm? And the answer is yes. And we actually Mike Watson's our meteorologist down in Melbourne Beach, Florida, that put out the forecast today. And he is going 3 to 4 and fair tomorrow, both the AM and the PM. And then it's going to be dropping off through the end of the week. So nothing substantial like we saw from Raleigh, because the storm's going to be moving so quickly out to sea, and the fetch isn't going to be as substantial, but some fun waves at times if you know where to look in Florida, but nothing like we saw with Riley. So hopefully that answers your question, Shane.
It's definitely crazy to think that a blizzard up off the Northeast can send swell down to a place that's warm and 75, 78-degree water down there like Florida. But one of the main things that we will pay attention to for Florida, especially the central part of the state, is, Charlie and Mike down there mentioned a lot about the tides and how that impacts a lot of the sandbars there. And there is a high tide at 6:30 tomorrow morning. So that's going to slow down the surf for many spots as the tide drops through the day into an early afternoon low. It's going to help things out there. So that's worth keeping an eye on, that low and incoming tide during the afternoon on Wednesday for Central Florida.
All right, Kurt. Well, thank you for all your insight. As always, we're going to let you get back to the forecast desk. You got a couple of Caribbean forecasts to put out, I believe. And once again, I'm Surfline Director of Forecasting, Mark Willis. I've got Kurt Korte with me, lead forecaster. We're from the Outer Banks. We hope that you've enjoyed our forecaster discussion on Winter Storm Skylar, the third nor'easter in less than 3 weeks to impact the East Coast. And be sure to check out all the forecasts on Surfline to see if your spot is going to get any swell from Skylar. And we'll be probably doing this again tomorrow from other parts of the East Coast. And be sure to like our Facebook page so you can be alerted the next time we go live. And also be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page where you can also listen to these and watch these streams live. So thanks, everyone. And thank you, Kurt.